For those of you who are joining, today's webinar will be approximately an hour long, 45 minutes active presentation and 15 minutes allotted at the end for you to ask questions. Today's webinar will also be recorded, so you will receive a recording of today's webinar via email tomorrow, and please feel free to share that with your friends and colleagues. Okay, we're doing quite well now at this stage, and we're coming up on the hour. So I'm sure you all know what you're here for. We've got a webinar today on notified body collaboration and the successful strategies for manufacturers. John Kilmartin has kindly offered to do that for us today. John, would you mind moving on to the next slide, and I'll just tell people a little bit about Trinzo while we wait for everyone to join. So my name is Katie Cooney, and I'm the Training Centre of Excellence Lead here at Trinzo. You're all very welcome. For those of you that haven't worked with us or haven't heard of us, we are a quality and regulatory consulting company. We are a global company, and we work with pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturers around the world. And we work on any number of different types of projects. We take a very bespoke approach. Sorry, one second. I have something come up on my screen. We have a very bespoke approach to those customers. And we've worked in anything from MDR implementation, technical file creation, gap assessments, audits, and that could be anything from a basic QMS audit to a more specialized audit. We can do staffing solutions for companies that need maybe extra firepower for a period of time to get projects over the line. We work on project collaborations. We also have worked with companies on areas such as quality behavior and quality culture. And remediation projects have been a specialty of ours in the past, working on anything from process validation, QMS, etc., etc. So a large number of services. If any of you are interested in working with Trinzo on anything in the future, or you have something currently on your mind, you can contact us by going to the website trinzo.com, and there is a contact us page there where you'll be able to contact us directly. So we'll just go quickly to the next page there, John, and then I'm afraid I'll be handing over to you after this one. So as I said, there is an opportunity to ask questions today. So there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you float your arrow over that, and you will be able to see a speech bubble that looks like two speech bubbles overlapping and the words Q&A underneath. If at any point today you have a question, please do type your question into that Q&A bubble. Nobody will see the question except for myself and John. We will be able to see them, but other participants won't be able to. So you can type your questions in there, and we have allotted 15 minutes at the end of today's session to answer those questions. So please feel free to ask away as they come to your head, and we'll get to them at the end. So without further ado, I would like to welcome John Kilmartin, and I'd love him to introduce himself and thank him very much for taking us through today's presentation.
Great. Thanks very much, Katie. Yeah, so my name is John Kilmartin, and thank Trinzo for the opportunity to present on this topic today. It's something that I've shared with a number of educational institutions over the past number of months as well. So basically, my background up until about 6 months ago, I was the VP of Regulatory Affairs at Medtronic, based in the European facility in Galway. And over the past number of months, I've been exploring a number of different opportunities, some of them in the academic world, where I've recently taken on an adjunct professor role with the University of Galway in the Institute for Clinical Studies. And I'm also working with Dr. Tom Melvin in Trinity as well with Tom has started a master's in regulatory affairs there as well, and doing some consultancy work also. So thanks very much for the opportunity. Katie and Abby did all the hard work in the background. So today, very much today is really just a perspective on working with different notified bodies. All of you will have your own perspectives. Today is not in anything like a technical presentation. It's really maybe talking about the softer side of negotiating and working with a notified body. And I know a recent Harvard Business Review talked about the art of negotiating and being observant and building a rapport. And then often, as many of you will know, negotiating an outcome is never a binary thing. It's never a win or a loss, but it's typically each side has to achieve some of their goals. So I think one of the biggest things, for myself and some of the teams that I've led in the past is just simply building that trust and credibility with your regulatory agency, and particularly your notified bodies. And I think it's also shown that degree of empathy. It's been a very difficult period, particularly in Europe, obviously with the EU MDR, but it's been difficult for manufacturers, but it's been particularly difficult for notified bodies, who are often, as we described, as they're kind of the squeeze middle. So they've got the competent authority on one side and the manufacturers in their ear at the other side. So part of our role sometimes in industry as well is to protect the notified body and give credit where credit's due. So that's really the agenda for today. First of all, obviously in any strategy with a notified body is understanding the environment and being observant to what's happening out there. I think that's key. How we worked with and negotiated with notified bodies 10 years ago is very different to the environment that we're working in today. I'll share some survey data. I'll quickly skim over that. There's some really good survey data coming out. And again, it just gives a sense of the environment, but it also shows us that, despite some of the extensions, there's still lots of work to do for both manufacturers and for notified bodies. And then finally, I'll share some of my own perspectives, working with the various notified bodies. And as many of you know, regulatory in medtech is a very small world. So, your integrity and your reputation are important. And so I think, going back to building that trust and credibility is really important, regardless of which notified body you're working with. So I'll just cover 3 topics here on what I would call the environment. And really, this is the first one. I always like this slide. I think it's a quote from a BioInnovate course that's run here in the university. And I think it's helping particularly entrepreneurs, empathy and the ability to put yourself in the shoes of others. So we've all been there in industry. We've all been there, the frustration with our R&D engineers or manufacturing engineers who are trying to make a change, or the marketing team who are trying to make a claim in an advertising promotional piece. But I think it's also really important then to put yourself in the seat or the shoes of the regulator, and their mindset, as they're reviewing, for example, a design dossier or technical file. What if I missed something? Are there deviations in the reports here that I've missed? Is this data on the final finished device, or is the device representative? Internally, as a notified body, will I get this through my panel? Would there be gaps if there was a competent authority audit, et cetera? Is the clinical evidence adequate? So I think it's really important just to kind of ask yourself those questions as you try to put yourself in the seat of the regulator. The second point here, many of you will have seen versions of this slide, but as we all know, regulation is typically a product of history or historical circumstances. And it's typically, over the years, has evolved in reaction to a crisis. So it's typically been reactive rather than proactive. And that's fine. And that means typically, though, there are peaks and troughs. There are peaks and troughs in terms of innovation versus, regulation. And, today, I'm not going to be debating the pluses and minuses of EU MDR, but more so to kind of give you a sense. So I often use the example, the businesses that I worked in with Medtronic was in cardiovascular. 10 years ago, I attended what would be the large TCT, a large cardiovascular conference. And, at that point in 2013, there was a lot of angst over FDA driving innovation out of the US. Unintentionally, there was very little clinical research happening in the US or whatever. And then 10 years later in 2023, you attend the same FDA town hall meetings at TCT, and the question is almost inverted, and what's happening in Europe, what has happened to Europe, et cetera. So that's the peaks and troughs that typically happen. But that also gives me hope because, in Europe, I think we are probably on the start of that upward, trend. I genuinely believe that we're starting to slowly see some green shoots in terms of, very positive progress in Europe. So fingers crossed in relation to that. And then the third part of the environment is the innovation gap is closed. So we've all seen this. So we all probably work with global regulations and global regulators. And, this narrative has evolved. And it really, in Europe, it has probably put extra pressure on the Commission, competent authorities, notified bodies. It's real. We would see as manufacturers, we would see this happening in reality. If you talk to your business unit leaders, their general sense is that it's not easy to do business in Europe at the moment, mainly the unpredictability, piece to it. And we as regulatory professionals based in Europe, we often get the question, are there innovation pathways in Europe? Can we get something like breakthrough device designation, early feasibility studies, et cetera? So they're the questions that we're being asked, and I think rightly so. I think we do need to challenge ourselves, in Europe, and as we know, even MedTech Europe, have issued a position paper, recently, where again there's a broader look at the regulatory infrastructure in Europe, and looking at efficiency, innovation, and governance. So that's part of the environment. So I think just being aware of that is very important. So now I'll move on for a moment, and I just wanted to share a little bit about, the last year. Things have moved very quickly over the last 12 to 14 months. So this is a slide that I had presented at a meeting of ESC, European Society of Cardiologists, in Paris in November 2023, and there were others. Richard Holbrook was there from BSI, Donald O'Connor from HPRA, representatives from Core MD, but this was the narrative, the messaging at that time. It was probably just 1 month ahead of the extensions, which came in then in December and implemented in March. But there was a lot of conversation about legacy products, in particular. So that was the narrative, led to the extension of the particular timelines. The next few slides, I'm not going to dwell on them. They'll be in the pack, as Katie mentioned. So there's some really good information now that's available to us as regulatory professionals. So some of you will have seen the European Commission have commissioned a study led by the Austrian National Public Health Institute to collect data on certificates issued and cert applications. And I think it's going to be interesting as we see that. I believe there's more information, hopefully, I think at the end of this month or next quarter, where we'll see the next version, of this. And but you can see back in November, when we looked at the data, that came out at that particular point in time, there were almost 14,000 or over 13,000 applications with about 3,900 certs issued. So about 29% of the certs that were in application were issued. So I think we have to watch out for here as this goes forward. We don't want that gap to widen in terms of the number. You can see the trend. It's good that there's applications going in there, but I think we have to just make sure that we don't see a widening of that gap at the end of the curve there. Probably are some slightly mixed messages, at different forums that I've heard over the past number of months. Rightly so, manufacturers are being strongly encouraged by, the likes of Irish MedTech Europe to get their files in. Please file is the message coming from notified bodies, competent authorities, etc. And there still are some incomplete applications. But I guess we have to wait and see it in relation to the review times, and will they start to decrease? I think we're just going to have to wait and see. So the next version of this data from the Austrian National Public Health Institute will be really important for us. These are some other slides looking at both the QMS applications and the product applications. And again, about 29% of those files are approved. This was a slide deck then that was prepared relatively recently as well by the Irish MedTech Association. And again, it's really just looking at, I think the key message here is that the majority of notified bodies are saying that it's still taking maybe over 13 months to secure a product cert at that point. So I guess we'll be looking and waiting and seeing where hopefully that trend will come down. We're starting to see this is a very small survey that was conducted by the local industry association here in Ireland, a very small sample size, between 12 and 23 companies. But the narrative at this quality and regulatory forum, was very much that companies were starting to see some improvement, particularly the larger manufacturers who had probably started their MDR journey a little bit earlier. So that was probably the message, that the larger multinationals were a little bit further along the learning curve than the SMEs. And then finally, any of us who've been involved with EU MDR applications, in Europe, think it's really important to keep a good track of, what are the areas of submission review feedback, and, are you aligned with the rest of industry? Are you seeing something different? So again, this was a small survey, but the themes were important. So 4 themes, emerged in relation to the types of submission feedback that manufacturers were getting. So obviously, one of them was clinical evidence still remains, a high number of questions. Design and performance, sterilization came up there. That may have been unique to a couple of companies and to a particular notified body. And then risk management. So again, the dialogue and the narrative around this survey at the time, a couple of months ago, in the kind of the open forum, the general sense was that various notified bodies maybe have slightly different areas of emphasis. And I don't think you can truly urge caution with that. But the general narrative at the time was that BSI do tend to have a strong focus on clinical and clinical evidence. TÜV tend to have a strong focus on traditional engineering, design verification, etc. And Dekra generally tended to follow the risk management process and where that led them to. So that was the general narrative. Again, it's nuggets. There's always exceptions, to that, but that was just a general narrative as part of the dialogue that occurred at that quality and regulatory forum. So now I'm going to move on now, and maybe the main part of today's conversation is just some thoughts around, how to navigate the environment in Europe, particularly at the moment. So again, taking the environment into account, the stresses and strains that manufacturers, commission, competent authority, notified bodies, are under. So I often would talk about this triangle of cooperation, and I think that's what it needs to be. This can be a symbiotic, relationship, particularly for these 3 stakeholders, where the success of each is very much dependent on the other. So we as manufacturers, very much rely on, the interaction with our notified body, and then indirectly with the competent authority, or directly if it's in post-market world. So just really important to note that, maintaining this relationship is really important. Reminding, I know that this audience need no reminding of this, but reminding maybe your internal organization, particularly if you work for a small or large, corporation, is ultimately who is responsible for placing, our devices on the market, and that ultimately, rests with the manufacturer. So the mindset that as regulatory professionals that we need to encourage and adopt internally is that your bar internally in relation to technical file design dossier expectations should indeed exceed those of your notified body. And sometimes a way of doing that is in the past, you kind of asked yourself very carefully as to who would sign your declaration of conformity. Now it may be a little bit more restrictive now, in relation to that, but it's a really good message in terms of making sure that someone who's responsible and accountable in the organization is aware when that declaration is being signed off. So now moving into the meat of the conversation, and again, a lot of this will be some of the learnings along the way. We've made lots of mistakes, and different notified bodies have different approaches that they prefer to work with. So maybe a little bit controversial again for this audience, but what I've said here is that in some ways regulatory is easy. The regulations are there, you look at them, you have to interpret them, you gather the data, you collaborate internally. But that relationship building, that effort that's required, particularly with your regulator, that's the hard bit. That's the bit where you have to build trust and build credibility, as I mentioned at the beginning. And a couple of things, obviously, we've all heard about this, that the notified bodies cannot consult, but that doesn't mean that you cannot have really good technical engagement with your notified body. And I'll give some examples of that later. Second point there would be also what process works well for them. Sometimes we become very biased in our own internal communications. We think we know the type of information that the notified body wants. Is it email? Is it a regular tracking sheet? is it escalation, de-escalation, or whatever? So I'd just simply say, ask them what process works best, for them. And then get to know their internal structure. Really important for you to understand, where is the reviewer responsible to? Is there a scheme manager? Is there a key account manager? What's their internal escalation mechanisms? I think that's really important for you to understand, because there may be times where you do need to escalate, but there's also times where you need to de-escalate. Things sometimes can move quickly within organizations, whether that's the manufacturer or whether that's the notified body. And really just getting to understand how they operate internally. For example, how much autonomy does the clinical reviewer or the technical reviewer? Where does the sterilization information feedback in? Ultimately, who makes the call on it? And I think that's really important for you as an organization to get to know. And again, I've the text in italics there at the bottom is simply along, going forward, manufacturers need to build more trust, practice diplomacy, and commit appropriate resources to respond to notified bodies' needs in a timely manner. So we do know, obviously, we're under pressure as manufacturers. We can be frustrated at the unpredictability and the timelines associated with the notified body process, but I think we have to also look internally first and say, well, what can we do? What's within our control to optimize the environment in which we're in. So that's just some broad conversations around that. So then maybe I'll share some working principles, and this is just a case study with a number of products that we work with BSI, and these are just, again, some tips and tricks that we felt were helpful in those case studies. And there's probably some of my former Medtronic colleagues on the line here who really made this possible. So what I would say, the first two things here is developing trust and credibility. So what I mean by that, is, for example, helping the reviewer answer the question, is there anything in this file that we're missing? Are there any deviations that were justified? So we know that those questions are going to be mulling around in their head as they review this file. So I think, being upfront with that and making them aware if there were deviations, if there's data there that was justified, if there was a sample or clinical data where it was a representative sample rather than the finished device. I think upfront being transparent about that. Sometimes manufacturers can be a little bit coy about doing that and say, well, I don't want to get into the justification as to why it's representative. In my experience, the more transparent you are, the earlier, the better the outcome. Ultimately, what you want is a good outcome for your company, and that's also a good outcome for the notified body. I often talk as well about internally, you're their voice, so giving credit where it's due. It can often be very easy for business leader might say, hey, that file took, 11 months to approve. That's crazy. We used to get those line extensions through in 5 to 6 months. Your role there might be to say, yeah, that's true. We would like it to be, much shorter than that. But right now, do you realize the industry average is 13 months? So you're trying to put it in context for your organization internally. So there are just some thoughts in relation to giving credit to the notified body where it's due, and I guess empathizing with the position they're in. The next few points here, engaging early and often. Now, I realize that might be a little bit easier for a multinational versus an SME, and I've heard that many times. I've been involved in industry associations for many years, and I think the perception, and there may be some truth in that, is the multinationals sometimes can get access to the notified bodies much quicker and easier than the SMEs. But regardless, I think, the thought process needs to be, how early can I get in there, and engage? And, and I'll give an example of, we had a next generation drug-eluting stent. We had really good experience going in to the notified body early. It helped prepare us, but it also helped prepare them. What types of reviewers did they need? Where were the borderline areas going to be? Did we need a medicinal reviewer? Is the clinical evidence, how does it look? Is it on the finished device, etc. Actions speak louder than words. What I'm referring to there is that if you make commitments to the to the notified body, and in this case it was BSI, we agreed, for example, a modular approach to the filing. That meant that BSI had reviewers lined up, and then the onus and responsibility was on us. Then was, did we get the data in a clear format? Did we get it in on time to them? And the third bullet point here is building trust. And I just give some examples. Again, the tendency, and we were probably guilty of it ourselves many years ago, was maybe being scant on the information early on. We're thinking that's going to lead to a question. I know it's fine, but I think the approach that that I would encourage now is being transparent early. So, for example, some particularly smaller manufacturers might say, I have a couple of changes that I think I'm going to hold off on bringing them up at the moment, but we're going to try and amend the file later, down the line. Sometimes, it may be prudent to flag those changes, give the notified body some indication as to when they might be coming and the significance or not, of them. So that's just something that over time I've probably changed my, approach on that. Sharing test deviations as well. They've seen many files. They'll see design verification, bench test data that says pass, pass, pass. And not everything is always as clean as that. So sometimes actually acknowledging, yes, there was a deviation. This is what happened. It was a test method. It was a fixturing. We repeated it. It was fine. So that gives them the comfort that there's nothing underlying between a nice clean table that just has simply passed on every bench test report. And then field complaints. This is one that's always a tricky and difficult subject and narrative with the notified body, where you may have some feedback. It may be usability data coming back from the field where the manufacturing engineers or industrial engineers would like to make a tweak to your device. It's not a safety issue. There's no concerns in relation to performance as such, but being upfront with that when you are making a change with the notified body is giving them the full picture as to the motivation behind the change. And again, in my experience, that's been helpful later down the line when it gets close to the approval process. And then this is just, many of you will have your own versions of this, and this is simply having a tracker of submission status. And this worked really well, different versions of it, depending on the number of files you've under review with your notified body or bodies. And just simply, I'll show an example of it later, but just simply making it clear that there's one source of truth. So there can be multiple emails on a file. There can be discussions with the scheme manager, discussions with the reviewer, discussions with senior management at BSI and with the company. So it's great to have one source of truth, and there's shared ownership on that both the notified body and the manufacturer can feed into. So this is just, again, during MDR, again, just to give you a sense of some of our engagement during that process, and obviously that continues now in Medtronic and in most of the companies. What I would say here is that the reviewer relationship is really important. Having a tracker sheet, very simple tracker sheet. Again, ask them what works for them. It can just be simply what's the product or the project, who's the reviewer, who's the manufacturer or contact, what's the status, has an amendment been filed, was it filed on time, are there questions that their notified body are waiting on responses on, and then just next steps and actions. Keeping track of that and managing it very, very simply is good. With BSI, and every notified body has their own mechanism. Typically for us, it was a bi-weekly call with the scheme manager. And then if there were escalation items, they could be brought up on what I would call a monthly call. And really, we kind of reserve that for unresolved issues, things that weren't resolved at the team level, with the scheme manager. And that may have been simply a resourcing issue across the notified body or across the manufacturer that the scheme manager or the regulatory professional couldn't solve and needed escalation. And then finally, and again, this is probably more of a function for the larger manufacturers, where quarterly meetings with notified body leadership, where there's a comparison of metrics, really good rigor around that, and helps again both organizations to get a sense of where they're at in relation to the relationship and in relation to their metrics in relation to applications filed, approvals, average approval times, etc. So that's just I guess, cadence of one notified body and how we operate it. But everyone can work out what's the best cadence for your own engagement depending on the notified body needs. So now I'm going to jump on. I'm going to share some, I would call them observations from three of the notified bodies, BSI, TUV, and Dekra. And again, most of this feedback is collated from primarily the Irish medtech sector and their experience. So it's very much broad strokes, but I think it's helpful. It's sometimes the type of information that can be helpful, even if you're either choosing your notified body or wondering how best to operate with them. So maybe I'll start with BSI and just a couple of perspectives on them. And obviously your perspectives will often be colored either positively or negatively, depending on your experience with your reviewer or your scheme manager or whatever. But I think the general sense in relation to BSI, very technically very strong in certain areas, in particular some certain disease states. I happen to primarily work in the area of coronary and cardiovascular, and they were excellent in that area. Yes, they did have a strong focus on clinical evidence, and they've always had very strong, I would call, policy folks within BSI. Obviously, Richard Holbrook's a very, very competent from a clinical lead perspective at BSI, and the scheme manager works well. For us, our experience with the scheme manager and most companies that I've been speaking with seem to like that model. It seems to work well, gives that single point of contact, and allows a number of projects maybe to be juggled, at a time. BSI, we found, would have been pretty straightforward, to work with. You've got the escalation process. Often, yes, are there issues? Of course, there's not a file that doesn't go through where either the notified body or the manufacturer may be frustrated at something going through, and often it's a communication thing. Monthly calls, quarterly calls with metrics. Audit team versus technical team. This can be difficult. A lot of companies struggle, with this, where maybe your QMS audit, you've got a file under review and maybe the audit team picks up on something that the technical team haven't picked up on, or vice versa. So that's a challenge, not just with notified bodies, but also with many regulatory agencies, and trying to make that tight link between what's in under the design or technical file versus what the typical QMS audit team is looking at. And then I would say, as I mentioned earlier, BSI's presence at forums, conference, etc. That's very powerful. The likes of Graham Tunbridge, Susie Halliday, Richard Holbrook, etc. Very visible, and I think that accessibility to their senior management is welcome. So that's just some broad perspectives on BSI. On Dekra, I probably have a little bit less experience, with Dekra. So this is gleaned, maybe from a number of other manufacturers from within our industry association. The general sense is that they would be very pragmatic, tolerant of business priority changes. So sometimes, definitely historically, where companies may have had to tweak their regulatory strategy, I think Dekra were pretty flexible there. Big positive that I've heard in relation to Dekra is the close link between their QMS, their quality audit team, and their technical team. And from what I understand, they will often have someone from their design review team as part of the audit. So that's good. And I think historically, Dekra tend to have a strong risk management focus, which is probably a smart approach in terms of their audit trail, and their line of questions tends to come out from their risk management documentation. Historically, this may be changing, but historically they used to have a key contact per site. That may be now per product portfolio, whatever. Again, some strong and respected staff members. They did develop a very strong reputation for certain types of product families as well. I know particularly, and again, depending on which business or disease state you're in, but I know, for example, in the structural heart area, they had a lot of clients in that area. And then new clients, I'm not sure. I think Dekra probably over the past couple of years probably took on a lot of clients. So again, I'm unsure as to their capacity for newer clients at the moment. But that's just some perspectives on Dekra. And then just on TÜV, I would say, again, technically strong. Any of you who are working with TÜV will know the areas in which they have strong historical competencies. Very, very strong on their own internal processes and procedures and following them. So I think getting to know what their internal checklists, who the internal reviewers are, how that operates is really important. And technically, they have a very, very strong staff around and focus on design verification, sterilization, packaging. There are some of the themes that we would have heard in relation to the types of questions maybe from TÜV, but also the areas of strength for them. Pretty straightforward to work with. They have what we would refer to as key account managers. And again, they had various escalation mechanisms, depending on whether you're based using TÜV, whether you're based in the US or whether you're based, in Europe. Sometimes, you may have to bridge both. There may be situations where you might be working with TÜV in the US, possibly for your QMS and your audit aspects, and you might be working with the local team in Munich for your technical files. So that can get, a little bit clunky from time to time, but, again, it's just a matter of working through that and understanding who does what. And again, with often a very strong presence at forums and conferences, the likes of Merton Vitti, etc. So that's the kind of the broad. They're obviously probably the three larger notified bodies that have, that we would have engaged with over the last number of years. So let me just jump on here and just to kind of maybe conclude on a couple of themes. So sometimes it feels like this in terms of manufacturers, particularly over the last number of years. And I know as I was preparing, this presentation, here I am, saying, hey, empathize with the notified body, put yourself in their shoes, etc. All of that messaging, but at the same time, I know we've all been through the frustration of EU MDR and trying to understand what is the bar, what is the new data, how do I address that GSPR when my old ER checklist was a tried and trusted tool, for me. And I think we, and also what I would say is trying to, as a regulatory professional, it was very difficult to balance the expectations of your organizations. So on a call earlier today, we talked about the fact that, maybe the blessing in disguise with EU MDR is that it has brought the regulatory professionals out into the, front and center in relation to business strategies. I think the organizations now realize that when the regulatory processes are working really well, then it's fine for the regulatory folks to be working hard and diligently in the background. I think with the EU MDR and all of the subsequent supply chain challenges, that emanated, from that and trying to manage inventory, etc. I think it brought regulatory professionals, into the spotlight. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing, but I think overall, I think it's important that that we see ourselves as a strategic partner and that we're trying to help the organization to find solutions and not just the simple regulatory review and approval process. So with the notified bodies, I would say on all regulators, trust is earned. It's very, if you ever have a conversation with a regulator who's maybe moved from one regulatory agency to another, or maybe someone in FDA, they will always tell you that they know the organizations and they know the individuals who are not trying to pull the wool over their eyes. So over time, that becomes very obvious to the regulatory agencies, and that trust is earned. And as I said earlier, actions speak louder than words. So being transparent, being honest in your filing strategy, and helping the notified body to understand that is key. Building that relationship at all levels, I think that's really important. As you can see, these organizations, the notified bodies, are large organizations now with multiple layers. So, and likewise, if you're in a large multinational like Boston Scientific or Medtronic or Abbott or Stryker, we also know the complexities associated with information maybe getting, lost as you either go up or down the chain. But particularly for your notified bodies, I would urge to build those relationships at all levels, whether that's at the technical reviewer level, at your primary reviewer, your scheme manager, key account manager, and upper management, because there's going to come a time where you're going to have that conversation and sit down and say, hey, this file, is fine. What do we need to do to get it over the line? Empathy and assuming good intention. The notified bodies have been under the same scrutiny as we've been under over the past couple of years. They're trying to do a good job in difficult circumstances. So I just think empathizing with their situation will get you a lot further than, banging down the door and, getting frustrated with them. I think we've all been there, but I think we've all learned that trying to understand where they are, where they're at, despite, their efforts, it may be that it's something is held up in panel. A reviewer is out. They've competing priorities. Very much the same sort of challenges that we have from an industry perspective. This one I put in as well, the de-escalation is important as escalation. Sometimes we as manufacturers often tend to escalate things really quickly. And that can be fine, but it's a little bit like the boy that cried wolf. Like, you cannot do that with every single file. I think you have to really think about which are the files that are most important to your organization. Have we done a good job getting them in there? Have we met our commitments? I think that's really important before you escalate. And then there's often situations where de-escalating, there may be a particular file that has gone over its time frame. And, I know there's many times we might have gone on the monthly call with the therapy lead, for example, at BSI, and said, that's okay. We need to prioritize the other two. If that goes over by, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever it is, we can live with that. So I think, giving that little bit of wiggle room from time to time will come back to you. And that's sharing the wins as often as the frustrations. One of the things that I guess we've learned to do, particularly with the reviewers and the scheme managers, is sharing if they've done a really good job getting a file through, if they've navigated it through the panel process or whatever, give them credit for that. Typically we get the cert, we take it, we run off, we get shipments out the door, and so I just think a kind of a recognition or thank you for that when it does come through. It's hard earned at both ends, but I just think sharing that is important. And the last point, which is really which is awareness of the environment and available resources. So that goes back to my first 3 slides, which is very much what's happening in Europe at the moment, what's happening with the notified bodies, being aware of where are they at from a resources perspective. I think we're starting to see and hear notified bodies now touting for for business again. I think it's been a while since we've probably been in that space, so that's a good place to be. And hopefully over the coming weeks and months, as we start to see the data coming out from the various surveys, hopefully we'll get to a point where we can see those review times being most importantly being more predictable, and B, that hopefully they will reduce somewhat from the averages they're at the moment. So thanks very much everybody for your time. I don't think there's anything earth-shattering in the presentation other than just the tips and tricks that we've learned over the past number of years working with the various notified bodies here in Europe. So Katie, I'll stop sharing. I haven't been able to see the Q&A, but when I stop sharing, that may be the case.
I can see there are quite a few questions coming up now in the chat, John. So I can ask you a couple.
Okay, I can see them here now once I've come off sharing. Yeah.
Okay, so we've asked our to extend out ISO 13485 certification with our notified body, as we are developing a new IBD device, which is Class A according to our assessment. However, the notified body claims that the product is not an IVD but should be unregulated. Not sure how to deal with this. Is this the manufacturer that needs to make this call, or can a notified body refuse to follow the rationale of the manufacturer?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, general sense there would be, I think you'd probably have to continue negotiating. I don't think it would be a matter of saying, hey, we beg to differ and we're going to move forward. So I think for that particular organization, what they might need to do is maybe to get some sort of, a third party perspective, or I know some of the competent authorities are also very helpful. If I, for example, locally, if we talk about HPRA, they have helped in the past with designation and borderline questions. So I would say, maybe look for someone to arbitrate there. But my general sense would be, I wouldn't move forward without coming to, some sort of a clear position on it yourself internally.
Perfect. I'm going to go with the next one now then. Thank you, John. We have seen deadlines pushed back recently by the EU Commission. What checks and balances are emerging amongst the stakeholders that give confidence that we will not come to the same point in the future?
Yeah, I wish we had an answer for this one. It's a big question. Yeah, so we're all seeing a lot of the, obviously, last year we saw the MDR. More recently, we've seen, IVDs. It's a good question. It's difficult. I think that, when you talk to the competent authorities, they will acknowledge that from a commission perspective, the commission is not a huge organization. So if something, goes askew, like obviously, from a EUCOMED perspective, it can be difficult to get it back on track. And I think maybe that's where MedTech Europe are potentially, coming from. I mentioned earlier there about MedTech Europe, and there's probably a general sense. I think I don't have the exact text from their position paper, but 10 years ago, and if anybody mentioned any form of single or centralized structure or organization, I'm always careful with the language. In Europe, there would often be, the immediate reaction would be no. I think there's probably what I've seen from the MedTech Europe, position paper is the conversation around, need for efficiency, need for innovation, and the governance piece, and an accountable governance structure. So, they've talked about, I think the word they use is a single dedicated structure to oversee system level decisions. So that's not something that's going to, to happen overnight. So I don't think I could answer that confidently to say that confidence that will not come to the same point in the future. I think the data set and the surveys that we're going to see, particularly the next data set that we see coming from that Austrian, I forget the exact title, authority. Anyway, I'll come back to the title in a minute, Katie, is going to be telling us are we starting to see, is it anecdotal, or are we starting to see a real decrease in the review times? Is the capacity that we're hearing that the notified bodies have now, is that real? So big question. I think we'll learn a lot over the next couple of months.
Yeah, thanks for that, John.
I can see some of these, so I might
pick a couple there.
Yeah, I can pick a couple of these. Yeah, so on John's, there's one here on it was TÜV Süd I was referring to, not TÜV Rheinland, and I should have made that clear earlier. Is there a way to learn in advance notified bodies, product family, and their disease state strengths? Yeah, and I would say yes, there is. Some of them they tend to. You can also, well, first of all, you can look at their scope, what they're designated for. But I would also encourage you to go into the notified body and get a sense as to who are the other organizations that would tend to use that. And you can also see that on your competitors. When you look at your competitors' labeling, you can see their notified body number there as well. So I would say yes, it would be prudent to find that out in advance. The next question is, what options are open to manufacturers if they do not agree with an audit finding or a decision issued by their notified body, or generally feel their notified body is being unfair. Now, I know for some of the notified bodies that we negotiated with in the past, there was different levels of, I would call it, escalation. First one would be at the closing meeting. It would be at the closing meeting and trying to escalate it, there. And I do know that most notified bodies then have an arbitration type mechanism whereby if you don't accept the finding, you can go back, the auditor will go back and you go back, and there's a documented process that you'll follow. So it takes the heat out of it locally at the audit point, and the follow-up can be with the notified body more centrally. And that does happen from time to time. It can be misunderstanding, or it can be, just something where maybe they fundamentally beg to differ on the validity of the data or the testing. So the next one here is, what are your thoughts on bringing on second smaller notified body that's more agile than the big players? We have seen BSI become extremely slow on all fronts. MDR, changes MDSAT, and are considering another notified body that can help. So I would say you're probably not alone. A lot of people at the moment have been through the frustration, whether they've been with a small notified body or larger notified bodies, and we know there were capacity constraints in the overall system. I've had conversations with a number of companies recently, particularly smaller companies, who are thinking about moving, and I would always urge them to weigh up the pros and cons, and make sure that the pros of moving definitely outweigh it, because you've got all of the practical considerations, as well. So if that's your experience, and there are templates obviously in relation to weighing up those pros and cons. I'm not sure what the exact figure is, but at the moment, probably in Europe, I imagine that I'm guessing probably like 70% of all the devices are covered by the big three, but there are other notified bodies there. So I would say yes, definitely converse with them. But my gut reaction always is I would proceed with caution in changing notified bodies in the current environment. It's a tricky one to navigate, and you're bringing on board unknowns, as well into your organization. But that's easy for me to say, sitting here. But every situation is going to be unique. So just tread carefully would be my advice there. So the next question, really good one. Many of us work with several notified bodies, particularly in the multinational space. Have you seen two notified bodies have a different opinion on a compliance pathway for a certain requirement, and how have you worked to resolve that difference so that the business can adopt one standard compliance methodology? So that's a brilliant question. We have seen that many, many times. It's one of the criticisms, I guess, that's leveled at the European model, in that, it's the one regulation, but there can be differing interpretations of that. So obviously the infrastructure in Europe is trying hard with MDCG guidance documents, etc. So one of the things that we have done there, I'll maybe mention two possible either solutions or ways forward in that. So one would be, if you're confident, say, for example, notified body A has taken a particular approach and notified body B don't accept it. So one of the things that I would suggest would be bringing that and sharing that with them. We've definitely done that in the past. We've said, hey, this particular requirement in relation to shelf life, you're the only notified body that appears to be, interpreting it this way. So that has worked in the past. And then the other mechanism that we have used is anonymously through the industry association. The industry association has brought a few of those examples, both to notified bodies and to competent authorities. And that has helped to resolve it as well. So I'm sure there's other ways of doing it, but it's not unique. I think every single, particularly large multinationals who work with a lot of notified bodies, that's the frustration of the design teams, the design assurance teams, you know, etc. It should be just one answer. There should be just one, but unfortunately, it doesn't always work out that way.
Just over 5 minutes now, John. So maybe we'll have a few more questions.
Yeah. So a couple of tricky ones here. So hi, John. Thanks for the great information. When you get on the wrong side of a notified body regulator, what's the recovery strategy? So good question. I would say, you know, I think probably being very much, if it's something, for example, in relation to a product issue or a vigilance issue or whatever, I think showing good faith in fixing that problem as quickly as possible, not trying to kind of wiggle out of it, showing good, you know, compliance in relation to your kind of your vigilance responses and your, you know, corrective and preventative actions. That's particularly on the kind of on the post-market side. On the, you know, and there are situations even with FDA. So we're talking here mainly about notified bodies today, but you know, even with FDA, there can be situations where there's a genuine misinterpretation. So, for example, as many of you who work with US regulations will know, for a PMA product, you can have annually reportable, you can have 30-day notices, you can have 180-day PMA supplements, and sometimes there are situations where, you know, companies, and we've been there as well, where you think a change is annually reportable and FDA may disagree. So I think simply bringing them through your thought process, and that's why having a really well-documented thought process as to what your regulatory rationale was. If they disagree with it, that's fine, but at least bringing them through your rationale. So lots of different, you know, I suppose there's not one good or easy answer to that one, but I think if you can demonstrate good faith in what you did, that's probably the best starting point. So do you see a time when an implantable MDR submission for a new product will be under 9 months again? So I think if you look at the current trends, I would love to see that, you know, back to that point. And again, it's not really about, how should I describe it? You know, tracking just solely on time. I think it's kind of the predictability piece is really important, you know, as we go forward, and maybe getting to a place where there's more flexible filing and response strategies, such as like modular type, you know, submissions. I would say I'd like to see that. At the moment, I think the trends are obviously higher than that. The next notified body survey will come back to that. We'll start to see what the downward trend in the review times are. I do, you know, it won't be for a while, but I'd love to see it back at a point where, yes, you could have something reviewed under 9 months. You know, the key thing, you know, is going to be where are the challenges within the notified bodies. So obviously, if your data is good internally for manufacturers, typically your lead time is your clinical evidence generation. That's typically your longest lead time. So it remains to be seen. I'd love to see it back at that point, but I'm conscious, Katie, we're probably almost up on time. So and to be respectful to everybody.
Yeah, we've only got 2 more minutes left, so we can wrap up now. There have been great participation, some fantastic questions there. Apologies to anyone that we didn't get to your questions, but we got through as many as we could. Thank you all for coming, and I also want to give a big thank you to John Kilmartin for being with us here today and for imparting his wise knowledge that collected over many years. So thank you very much, John. That was an excellent presentation, and thank you very much to everyone for joining, and we hope to see you again for the next webinar.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone, and enjoy your days. Bye.